Alrighty, so Paul is the director of the Lauren A. Waterman Nonprofit Resource Center at the University of Iowa. He has spent the past decade advancing nonprofit leadership, strategy, and public policy. But he's also a co-founder of the Iowa Nonprofit Alliance, which is our statewide network of nonprofits. If you're not connected into that, let us know. We can connect you. But he's an active voice for our Iowa's charitable sector. He engages decision makers locally, statewide, and at the national level on issues that matter for both charitable and philanthropic work. He teaches two nonprofit courses at the College of Law, and he also serves on our Iowa Supreme Court Commission for Continuing Legal Education. Paul is the 2024 recipient of the David J. Skorton Award for Excellence in Service to the University of Iowa. But most importantly, Paul is a longtime friend of the Community Foundation and has done quite a few sessions and partnered with us in many ways. So we really appreciate Paul being here. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Ellie. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for having me. I expect that the next 40 minutes or so will go really quickly. I'll start off by sharing my screen with a PowerPoint, but then I'll kind of come off of that as we go along, and we'll have more, I think, of a conversation. I think Ellie did a great job of introducing ourselves, who we are at our center. We're at your University of Iowa, as I like to say. We care an awful lot about the capacity of the entire state and the network of individuals and organizations that make it possible to make our communities better places to live. And so one of the ways we do that is by engaging in activities like this, where we get to meet with you directly. You already got some of my bio, so you don't need to see more about that, except for that's Jacoby. If you look in the photo, that's Jacoby there. This is just from a couple of days ago. Jacoby's at our Blank Park Zoo, giving you just a sense of what he thinks probably about myself and this presentation, even maybe. Just a little attitude there from Jacoby. So love the Blank Park Zoo. We always have to, as we do at the College of Law, say that we want this activity to be engaging. Like Ellie said, please use the chat at the beginning if you have any questions as we go along. And I love them. I love questions. And then we're going to reserve about 15 minutes at the end where we'll invite people to have a conversation back and forth. Disclaimer-wise, of course, while I am an attorney, I am not your attorney. So here, any legal, offer that we make in terms of information, please don't constitute this as legal advice for yourself. But by all means, if you have any questions after this, I'll have my contact information, and please feel free to reach out. I wanted to start a bit by just taking a look at the landscape, because I think it's pretty important to understand just who we are as a sector here in the state of Iowa. It might surprise you to know that out of the 339,000 or so business entities in Iowa, the third largest are nonprofit corporations. So this is from July 3rd of 2025. So I recently updated this. 31,930 nonprofit corporations in the state of Iowa. You see there in the 10th place, foreign nonprofit entities. And here foreign means not incorporated in the state of Iowa. They might be from Nebraska, Minnesota, Illinois, or other places. And we have over 1,300 of those. And then we have a few unincorporated entities that are not required to submit documents of incorporation, but 100 or so did there. And the very last one, a co-op, nonprofit co-op. We have one of those in the state of Iowa. So a big sector here in the state. We're the fourth largest employer in terms of a sector, really significant, as many of you know, in our communities in terms of both the mission-focused and our mission-supporting work. This slide just gives a bit of a sense, and this is going to be important as we talk about some of the rules around advocacy and lobbying, of the exempt entities, both in our country and in the state of Iowa. So when it comes to exemption, we've heard, oftentimes we're a 501c organization. Maybe you'll call yourself a 501c3, right, organization. That's part of the Internal Revenue Code. And you look at the number of 501c organizations in the United States, there's about 1.8, 1.9 million in the United States. And if you break those down, what this slide shows is the vast majority of those are 501c3 entities, about 1.5 million or so. There are, of course, other 501c entities, and the next largest are 501c4 entities, around 71,000 across the country. Now, if we were just looking at the state of Iowa, and again, this is all really updated from the Business Master File just from a few days ago, there's about 25,000 or so 501c entities. Much like the rest of the country, the vast majority of those, about 17,500, are 501c3 entities, but we have nearly 2,500 501c4 entities. And we're going to talk about those differences in a bit and why that matters for advocacy purposes. If we were to further break down 501c3s, you would break those down in terms of the big three tranches, the first being public charities. So as you see here, out of 17,500, 16,000 or so are public charities in Iowa. About 1,100 are private foundations, and 85 are private operating foundations. And all of this is going to be relevant as we talk about advocacy efforts. So that's a little bit of the breakdown. Here's a slide that I think is, hopefully not undervalued, because it really does, I think, for my part, give the best introduction to what I like to talk about when I think about advocacy. What it is and why we do it. First of all, the way I like to think about it is, what is it doing? What is it producing? And for us, we use that language that we all share, in terms of outcomes, right? Outcomes language. So advocacy can do a lot of things. It can raise awareness, right? It can raise awareness of potential issues, opportunities in our communities, but awareness ends up being a first step. It can inform and educate, right? So things that we perhaps, are aware of, but now, get to further know and understand, whether that's related to healthcare or the environment, education, whatever it might be. We can get more information that could be relevant, right, to understanding that particular area. Now, beyond, just educating and informing, come kind of the attitudes and beliefs and opinions we might have, right, regarding, a particular issue or opportunity, as I like to talk about. And whether or not those attitudes are positive or, those opinions are positive or negative can affect very directly your motivation to do anything, right? Because advocacy is oftentimes about motivating people. And that motivation might be direct. Like, for example, for healthcare organizations, I think we all are aware, we all have the knowledge that, eating healthy, right, a healthy diet, getting sleep, getting exercise, those are all elements that we think we're informed about, we're educated about. Perhaps we even have a positive attitude or opinion about those things. But are we all doing those things? Are we all eating healthy? Are we all, exercising and getting sleep? Right? I mean, right? That motivational factor ends up being something that is pretty crucial to the outcomes we're trying to produce. And then the relationships that come from this that are necessary oftentimes, to create the very thing that you wish to create community-wise. What creates and strengthens those relationships is oftentimes what we talk about with advocacy. So let me know if you have any questions there. Again, you can use the chat. Perhaps a lot of you say, "Oh, of course, this just makes a whole lot of sense." I also like to think about the why of advocacy in kind of two broad areas. One is our mission-related goals, right? Mission-related goals. So the reason that we exist, right? For our charitable purpose. What is it? And again, we know they can be religious. They can be related across a wide the arts. Wide variety of mission-related goals that we might have. The second is the mission supporting element to it. What makes it possible? What are the resources that that are strengthened by our advocacy to then support that work, right? Whether that has to do with things like what exemption, right, is possible for our organization, or what contributions are deductible, which is something that was updated in the last big beautiful bill that was passed in terms of non-itemizers being able to itemize potentially contributions. And so that mission supporting work is also, I think, a key to advocacy. No questions yet, Ellie? We're just going to move right along. Move right along. So when I'm asked about rules, again, I try to put it in a framework that I think is helpful. What are the laws governing my entity? And that's going to depend on several factors, right? So here I'm going to go a bit more lawyer than perhaps people like, but that's okay. We'll all get through it. The first could be the type of exemption that you have. And here we'll distinguish between those that are 501c3 entities versus 501c4 entities. What we're going to find about 501c4 entities is, so long as you're doing advocacy activity, especially lobbying, directly related to your exempt purpose, it's unlimited. But we're going to find that there are limits when it comes to 501c3 entities. Where you're classified under 501c3. So sometimes organizations will say, well, we're a 501c3 entity. We're not done with our analysis. We have to ask, well, are you a public charity or are you a private foundation? That's going to matter too, to certain elements of advocacy. And then the form or method of advocacy that you use. There's going to be differences in what's permissible in terms of public education, coalition building, versus something like lobbying and maybe even litigation. And then finally, where's your advocacy taking place? Different rules are going to apply here, or perhaps additional rules will apply, whether it's happening at the federal, state, local, or unelected levels, or perhaps if it's legislative, executive, judicial, or in the public. So those are all kind of the framing mechanisms. And this is very unfair because I teach, like Ellie said, 2 courses on this, and we would spend a lot more time talking about several of these elements, but you should at least know that they exist and potentially impact the advocacy work that you can do. So let's talk a little bit about these forms or methods that perhaps I know, and I can see several of you on this call, that I know several of you have used and are using to incredible effect. That first level of kind of awareness, education, and motivation, this can happen in all forms, right? It could be conversations that we have. How many of you, your board of directors, you ask them to be advocates for you when they're out in the community, right? When they're having conversations with, peers or family members. Perhaps it's materials that you're creating, could be brochures, letters, perhaps reports. Maybe you go a step beyond that and you actually get into something like commercials or social media, posts, or even create them, online or in-person forums or conferences. All of those, can be for the purpose of creating awareness, educating the public, and even motivating folks that you've identified. Now, who are those folks that we've identified, right? Well, they can be in what we call kind of different tranches, right? You could be trying to engage with the public, perhaps certain members of the public, maybe the parents of school-age children might be the public, part of the public you need to reach, or perhaps elderly folks in your community are the folks you're trying to reach. It might be influencers. So it might be those that we think have influence in the areas that we think are necessary. Those influencers now are perhaps more wide-ranging than they were even a few years ago. Perhaps before the media, we would consider to be pretty, significant influencers. Now it might be folks, who, are online, who have followings that we think are relevant. And then we have, of course, those decision makers or policy makers, right? The people who are either in elected, positions or perhaps appointed to positions. That, again, reaching them, whether it's through awareness, education, or motivation, could be helpful. Now, when we do some of that work, that's when we get into an area of something like direct lobbying. So direct lobbying, again, many of you will know this. And by the way, the first half of this conversation is really kind of nuts and bolts. And then the last half, we get into some really, I think, today, what's happening today kind of material that I think will generate a lot of conversation. But direct lobbying is pretty much a formula. It's attempting to influence legislation. It's a communication with covered officials. Now, who's a covered official? It can have a quite broad definition federally, right? Anyone from, that's, in a member of Congress, but also their staff, right? So all of a sudden, who's a covered, individual can be quite expansive. But could also be at the state level, defined at the state level, as it is in Iowa, as well as locally. But covered official refers to specific legislation. So it's not just general, hey, we have a general, topic of the environment. We want a clean environment, but you're not referencing any, legislation directly. So it's got to be specific legislation, and you have to reflect a viewpoint on it. That's the element of direct lobbying. The grassroots lobbying, that's when you're attempting to influence the general public through communications. And for the general public, it's really kind of a three-step test of, again, you have to refer to specific legislation, not just broadly. You have to reflect a point of view on the legislation. And the interesting part here is you have to include a call to action, right? Right, a call to action, meaning you give them, right, the direction to take, one of several next steps. Again, I know we're going through this quick. Litigation, this is probably something that's been more in the news in the last several months for nonprofit entities than any time in the recent past. But attempts to use the judicial system to challenge laws or defend rights is what litigation advocacy oftentimes looks like. But of course, there are many other forms, coalition building, influencers, regulatory advocacy. These are just some of the forms to give shape to our next piece. I did want to make this observation. I talk to a lot of members of the press. I talk to a lot of people who are in the public. I talk to a lot of elected officials. And I will say this, that all three of those can struggle when it comes to understanding the regulations regarding nonprofit advocacy, especially lobbying. And some common questions that we get, are, is this even permitted? It was just a couple months ago, I was in a conversation with a reporter, and it was like an hour-long conversation explaining, right, the permissibility of this work. How about donations? Are donors, supportive of using resources, for advocacy? Are there limits that apply, which we're going to look at here in just a bit? Does this mean, since you can do this, does this mean you can engage in opposing or advancing candidates for public office, right? So they make that connection pretty quickly. Well, if you can be for or against legislation, why can't you be for or against people for public office? If you do engage in lobbying, now do you have to disclose your donors? And we saw here in Iowa that a request was made from a legislator to a nonprofit entity asking, for a lot of information, including, who is donating to your organization. And for those that know, for 501c3 entities filing the Form 990, that schedule is not posted, right? And you're not required to give that schedule publicly. And then what if your activity is challenging positions currently, held by government? Which I find, and this is what's happening a lot in one of the next slides we'll go to. Like, is this challenging positions currently held by government? Is that what your advocacy is doing? Maybe, right? Or are you challenging majority held opinions of Iowans or majority held opinions of Americans? And the point here is maybe, I mean, possibly. In fact, it's probably a feature, right? We would argue it's a feature of nonprofit entities, right? The right for people to assemble and come together to advance areas that might not be a majority opinion or might be against perhaps currently held government positions. Those are all questions that we get. Perhaps you've gotten them too, and navigating them is part of what we'll talk about in the next 20 minutes or so. So it wouldn't be a talk, with a College of Law person unless we did put some code up on there. So this is your actual, 501c3 code. And what I wanted to highlight here was this part at the end where it talks about no substantial part of the activities of which, this 501c3 entities is carrying on propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation, lobbying, right? Except as otherwise provided in subsection H, and which does not participate in or intervene in, including the publishing or distributing of statements, any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. So I think it's pretty clear here what this means, right? At least in some instances. You can engage, we think, in influencing legislation, but it can't be a substantial part of what you do. All right, maybe not as clear as it could be, right? No substantial part, but it's very clear on political campaign activity, right? None of that. You're not allowed any of that as a 501c3 entity, either for or against candidates for public office. But we're going to see how that landscape might be shifting. So compliance from the IRS perspective for public charities. So this is for public charities now under 501c3. So some of you might still like to have the no substantial part test. And what that really basically is, it's a facts and circumstances test. It's a bit vague because what does substantial mean? Basically, what the court will do is they'll take in factors that they think are relevant to your activities. So for example, that time devoted by your organization to this activity, and this is again, lobbying activity, right? That very specific part of advocacy. That contact with covered, individuals, both by paid staff and volunteers, as what we've seen in terms of interpreted by the courts. Expenditures, for that lobbying activity to be done, mailings, media, perhaps grants to other organizations that are doing this work, holding rallies or conventions or other activities. And what's key here is that the strict sanctions that are imposed, if you're found to be in violation of a no substantial part test, right? Revocation of exempt status, you get an excise tax on the organization and its managers, 5% of lobbying expenditures. And all this is reported, this activity is reported on the Form 990, Schedule C, Part 2B. The other test is what we call the expenditure test or the 501H election. So there's two of these tests, and this is the second one. And this is where the lobbying is measured by the amount of money spent. You're not tracking time, you're not tracking those other elements, you're tracking the amount of money spent. And there's specific caps for organizations. We're going to look at that chart here in just a second. To qualify for this, you file what we call Form 5768, the year that you want that 501H election to first apply. And it does impose sanctions if you're in violation, not as strict as the no substantial part test. So what we'll say here is there's no revocation unless the organization is really exceeding, by 150% the cap of total lobbying or grassroots lobbying over a consecutive 4-year period. There's no tax penalties on managers. There is a 25% excise tax on amount spent over expenditure limit in a particular year. And this is reported in the Form 990 Schedule C, Part 2A. I promise it's going to get more exciting here in just a second. And here's that chart. And so here's the chart. So you see the exempt purpose expenditures. That's what kind of sets, the initial number that we're going to care about. So from $0 to $500,000, 20%, right? 20% can be spent on lobbying. Not insignificant, right? So let's say you have a $500,000 organization, the total maximum lobbying amount that you're permitted is $100,000. That's not insignificant, 20%. So important to understand. Now, that's total lobbying amount permitted. Grassroots lobbying, as we remember from before, is contacting the public, right? The max there for grassroots lobbying, that's the note on the side, is no greater than 25% of the total amount permitted for a lobbying year, right? So if you're in that, let's say you're a $500,000 organization, it means for that year, it would have been $25,000 would have been the max you could have spent. Now, let's say you're an organization over 17 million, right? There's a maximum amount here of 1 million. That's what you see at the very bottom right corner, which would mean a total maximum of $250,000 in a given year. Now, you might say to yourself, well, gosh, it just seems so much simpler to do the 501h election. Why wouldn't everyone choose to do that? Well, several different reasons why. One reason could be, and this is only relevant because these folks were with me in DC in June. I don't know if anyone's familiar or anyone here is from the Alzheimer's Association. They had their big day on the Hill. It was said to be the biggest day on the Hill for an organization. The most folks, and they were from all over all 50 states. I think over 1,000 people were there. This was actually on the Rayburn statue, very illegally placed on the Rayburn statue. But I made friends with people from Oklahoma and Florida, and they gave it to me because we made a bond as we were kind of talking about our efforts. But something like the Alzheimer's Association will spend millions of dollars, right? So of course they wouldn't do the 501h election because of the cap. And so even their 501c3 entity will do millions of dollars of lobbying. So it could be because you're such a large organization, you don't choose to make that your choice. A couple of notes here about some nuts and bolts, and then we'll get into the exciting part, I think. Compliance expenditures for private foundations. Remember I told you the 501c3 difference, public charities, private foundations. Well, here there's a strong public policy to dissuade private foundations from engaging in lobbying activity. So if you were, as a private foundation, to engage, you would get an excise tax of 20% if you were engaged in lobbying, right? And they think that 20%, that's going to stop a lot of organizations from doing it. But if that wasn't enough, you're going to get a tax of 5%, up to $10,000 for a single expenditure, on your foundation manager if they knowingly and willfully agree or permit to lobbying expenditures. See here, so there's really a sense that we do not want private foundations because of the way they're funded, oftentimes funded by fewer individuals, not public sources. And then if you violate any of those, there's additional taxes that are put on the foundation as well as the foundation manager, and the potential that if you do a substantial amount of lobbying, you lose your entire 501c3 exemption. That being said, I don't want any of the private foundation folks on the call to feel like they can't be advocates. You can be amazing advocates. You can still engage in building relationships with elected officials, educating and informing the public, influencers and policymakers, conducting your own research and publishing those results. You can support grantees who engage in lobbying. The key here, though, is that your funds are for general support or specific projects, not earmarked for lobbying activities. You can do all of those things and more. There is an exception to this because there are several exceptions, but the one that I'll highlight is if you're attempting to influence legislation as a private foundation that impacts your existence or your exempt status or how you're funded, your deductibility of contributions, similar self-defense activities, that is permitted. And so that's a bit of an exception. Oh, I lied. Here's a few more, just two more things on kind of the compliance level. Let's say you want to go to the State House, right? And you wanted to lobby. And so states have different lobbying rules. Iowa's is under Iowa Chapter 68B. Here are the 4 definitions of lobbyists. Those who receive compensation, those who are designated as a representative of an organization. You could be a government lobbyist, or you have an expenditure of more than 1,000 to communicate in person with members of the General Assembly. So those are some of the definitions of lobbyist. The key here is that you have to register on or before you start lobbying, and so that's something that is done, through the legislation, through the legislature, and so you have to make that registration. There is an exception here, though, that's relevant to our purposes. If you're an individual who's a member, director, trustee, official, or officer, or committee member of a business, trade, labor, farm, professional, religious, education, or charitable association, foundation, or organization who is, 1, not paid compensation, and 2, not specifically designated as provided, you may lobby without having to register. And so we know actually quite a few organizations can fall into this category. They wouldn't be required to register. On the federal level, there's what's called the Lobbying Disclosure Act. And just really quickly here, the points that we'd make is an employee of an organization or a lobbying firm qualifies as a lobbyist. And there's really two conditions. One, the individual made more than one federal lobbying contact on behalf of the organization over a 3-month period. They kind of work in quarters here with the LDA. And the individual spent 20% or more of their time working for the organization as an employee or that particular client as a lobbying firm engaged in lobbying activities during a 3-month period. Now, there is an exception to this, and this was updated this year in terms of expenditures. So if you spend no more than $16,000 on lobbying activities in a quarterly period, right, for an employee, you are exempt. And if you spend less than $3,500 in compensation, for a lobbyist that you've paid, you are exempt. So just to kind of, again, it's a thick book. So we're not getting through all of this, things that you're, precluded from doing, all of that. This gives you a general sense of what this all is.
Paul, we had
Okay, sure.
one quick question about lobbying.
Yeah.
Does the amount spent on lobbying include staff time or just direct expenses? Can you give some examples of what those expenses might be other than hiring a lobbyist?
Yeah, so it depends here a little bit on kind of who you're answering to. But let's just say this as an overall answer. I'll say that generally it's any activity related to lobbying, including the preparation that's required, for lobbying. It could also include research that's been done. If it's been done within a certain amount of time, preceding the lobbying activity, what you paid for that research could also be included in that amount. And this is all kind of based upon like a series of, sometimes it's based on a series of, months, quarters, but basically the answer is, especially if you're doing the activities, right? If you're doing the substantial part test, it's all the activities all the time that are related to the lobbying, including preparation for it. Good question. Okay, so some observations in kind of our last 10 minutes or so. The overall trust in the charitable sector is at risk. There's a level of scrutiny, I think, from elected officials at both the federal and state levels, as well as increased skepticism by influencers who are new oftentimes to the role and structure of nonprofit entities. And what examples I put up here are just what's happened in the last month or two. In fact, what's happened in the last 2 days for two of them. But we had a House Committee on Oversight and Accountability who had a session called Public Funds, Private Agendas, NGOs Gone Wild in early June. We had a House Judiciary Subcommittee on Oversight yesterday who held a session on how leftist nonprofit networks exploit federal tax dollars to advance radical agendas. And then today, we had the Homeland Security Committee have a session called An Inside Job, How NGOs Facilitated the Biden Border Crisis. Right? So these taken together with comments made by pretty influential people have made it so that the trust in the overall charitable sector is at risk. So what does that mean for us? Well, it means that all of us have to be thinking about how we're communicating not only our mission, but how we're accountable, what our role is in the community, how we have oversight as an area of strength. I know for several of you, we've been talking about oversight for years and years and years. It is the thing that, almost first on the agenda for a lot of boards, and almost all of our reporting, we're very cognizant of our oversight. And we need to share that, right? That we have strong oversight in the sector. Almost all public charities, of course, are led by a volunteer board of directors. Now, these are people who are our fellow community members. We know them, we trust them, and that's important. There are First Amendment, issues here. We've talked a little bit about rights, and here it's the right for us to peaceably, to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances, right? And so we know that the relationship between government and nonprofit sector, it can be complementary, it can be supplementary, but it can also be adversarial, and that's fine. That's actually a feature, right, of our organizations and our sector. So knowing that, I think is something we need to communicate if we're going to continue to build trust. And so I know this is a conversation happening locally, it's happening statewide, and it's happening nationally. What do we have to do to retain the trust that we've earned over decades? The second kind of observation I'll make is that very recent district court cases have impacted areas like federal funding and political activity. And here's just a handful of them. The National Council of Nonprofits, which I'll say we are a member, versus the Office of Management and Budget. You might know this, that there was a preliminary injunction back in February of 2025 because the administration had frozen funds, right? Funds that had already been allocated, many funds that had already been earned by, right, nonprofit entities. So that injunction was important to say, you got to distribute those funds, right? You're required to at least distribute some number of those funds. Elevate Baltimore versus Corporation for National and Community Service, operating as AmeriCorps. I know several of you are impacted, I think, by this AmeriCorps funding. This just came out, last week, or on July 7th. Their motion for preliminary injunction that was granted, and included the state of Iowa, talking about, again, here was a focus on Doge, but what was permissible, right, in terms of the rules that we have when it comes to those funds and their distribution. And then also on July 7th, we have the National Religious Broadcasters versus Commissioner of the IRS. And what this had to do with was the communications that happen in religious entities, in this case it was, churches, as well as a nonprofit entity, between, pastors and leaders and members, members of their congregation, right? Should the IRS restrict what we just saw before, a part of 501c3 that says, you cannot engage in political activity, you can't be for or against candidates. And it seems the momentum here, at least by this court and what was called a consent judgment, was no, that this violates First Amendment rights. And so in this instance, there should be a permissibility that would allow for that kind of activity. And we'll see how expansive that's going to be. Additional updates, again, this all happened in the last month. And my counsel here is that, while litigation advocacy has offered some examples where relief is more expedited than other methods, there's already shifts that are happening about when relief from district courts will be what we call, either nationwide or universal. And what just came down in June, end of June, was Trump versus Casa, which was a case that had to do with the appropriate relief of nationwide or universal injunctions. What basically the court said was in many cases, no, that it's only the specific parties that are here in this district that can get relief. And so the idea that there can be an entire, nationwide or universal injunction is something that, without a certified class, before the district court, the applicability of that now has shifted. And so what does that mean for organizations that, had in part benefited from, similar cases? And this is my final part about kind of political activity. There's been legislative movement. So in addition to the judicial cases I talked about, there's been a legislative movement to remove these restrictions on public charity engagement and political activity, and a broader one. So not just religious entities, but all charitable entities, also known as a repeal of the Johnson Amendment. And this was been introduced over several years. It was introduced again this year in March under HR 2501, called the Free Speech Fairness Act. And there is a clash here of constitutional issues and constitutional rights, right? The freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, but also the importance of nonprofit nonpartisanship. And so I guess here my counsel would be, if public charities are permitted to engage, if we think about this, if they're permitted to engage in political activity for or against candidates for public office, how would that change our organizations, right? How would it change perhaps our board of directors? Would the public be as favorable for tax exemption? Now that we know that you can make contributions, tax exempt or tax deductible contributions to 501c3 entities that are now directly engaging in political activity. And so what I think is policymakers do need to hear from charitable leaders, the reasons why protecting nonprofit nonpartisanship aligns with their charitable purpose. Well, I know I went through a lot. I lied. I never stopped my my screen. I'll also include my contact information in the chat, but now we could probably maybe have an opportunity for us to just have a conversation if folks would like.